had last time. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second week of 10200, Monday's plenary lecture. Nice to see you all again. Some are just joining now. That's fine. I'm going to record. It's already recording. And for the benefit of those who will watch it later, and I know that's probably several hundred of you, I do want to apologize for the poor resolution of last week's upload. Something went wrong either in the Zoom compilation or the YouTube compilation. Somewhere along the line, we lost the normally good resolution of these videos. And as a result, I'm aware that those who watched the upload asynchronously were not able clearly to discern the text on the screen when I shared extracts with you from Descartes' meditations. They were clear in our Monday session, as they normally are, but in the recorded video, I know that the text was very blurred and extremely hard, if not impossible, to read. So I think that problem has been solved. I think I know what caused it. Famous last words with technology, right? There are lots of ways for it to fail and also some ways for it to succeed. So I think I've solved the problem, and we'll find out later tonight when I upload this video, but it should be okay. Let's keep our fingers crossed. So without further ado then, we're going to launch ourselves into a very different kind of radical philosopher this week, who is partly opposed to Descartes and also has some things, it turns out, in common with him. Before we move on to Barclay and look at his very radical ontology, I would like to ask whether there are any questions about Descartes' first two meditations, which were covered last week, both in my plenary last week with you, right? We covered the first meditation, and then in your breakout lectures, presumably you covered the second one as well, as I did with section M. Does anybody have any questions about Descartes before we move on? All right, no response, meaning good. Silence I take for an affirmative. And I think Descartes is clear and not difficult to read. He wrote in a very straightforward way, even though it's been translated out of French into English and is almost 400 years old. I think the text is fairly clear. So you understand what his epistemology is. He's a rationalist. And you also understand how that leads him into a dualistic ontology, right? He's what we call a substance dualist. He believes there are two kinds of things in the world. There are things that are made of mind stuff, which are not physical, like our thoughts, for example, and anything else that's in our minds or on our minds. He doesn't think that's physical. Conceptions about mathematics and so forth, those are not physical things, those are mental things. But he also acknowledges that there is a physical world. It's just that he can't trust his senses to give him reliable information about it, right? And in his most radical formulation of this skepticism, he also allows himself to wonder whether indeed some evil genius is not deceiving him into thinking that the physical world exists, and in fact, maybe it doesn't. Although he kind of retreats from that a little bit, if you've read on and digested him. He pushed that as far as it could go. And he did conclude that there was really no infallible way for him to determine whether reality really exists or whether it's an illusion. And of course, that reminds us of The Matrix, right? Because indeed, in The Matrix and in similar films, it is almost impossible to know the difference between reality and our imagination. So that's where Descartes goes, but he ends up settling on this kind of dualistic view ontologically, whereby he certainly believes that there are mental existences because he can think them as you can anytime at all, and also believes that there is a physical world, only our knowledge of it is far less certain, and that's precisely because our knowledge of the so-called outside world or extra-mental reality, meaning reality outside of mind, all of our information about that world comes to us one way or another through the senses. If you think about it, any scientist who is doing empirical or experimental science is using the evidence of the senses. Experiments are all about the evidence of the senses, data that we gather from no matter what phenomenon we are studying, from the very small to the very large. All those data that come to us come through the senses. And even when we develop instrumentation, and technology gives us lots of ways of magnifying what we're seeing. If you look through a microscope or you look through a telescope, you may be looking at smaller objects in order to see them, or you may be looking at very distant objects in order to see them. But at the end of the day, we're still seeing them. So even those instruments are utilizing our senses, and the data we gather comes through our senses and so forth. So Descartes is always less sure about the physical world because he doesn't trust the senses. And I think you've all grasped that pretty clearly, or I certainly hope so. Now we're going to move on to Barclay. And Barclay is going to give us a very different picture, although there will be, in the end, some similarities. Barclay is an empiricist. And if Descartes' bumper sticker as a rationalist, remember, he believes primarily that reliable knowledge and understanding comes from the mind and from our faculty of understanding, which is, again, a non-physical thing for him, located somewhere in the mind. You remember the example of the wax. So Descartes' bumper sticker is, I think, therefore I am. Barclay's bumper sticker would be that existence is perception. It's a very different thesis. So Barclay's epistemology is, in fact, we only know things through our senses, and certainly as far as existence is concerned, if we could not sense anything, then nothing would exist for us. And that we'll see how he develops that argument. So for him, existence is all about perception. And his ontology is going to be that of monism. He's going to deny, this is very shocking. And those of you who really get to the bottom of Barclay, if you really understand Barclay, and some of you will, you'll be shocked by him. Some of you may not really clearly understand what he's saying. But he's telling us that at the end of the day, everything we know about the physical world comes to us through our senses. And that's the only way we know anything about existence is through our senses. And also, he's going to argue in a very devastating way that the ultimate knowledge we have about the physical world that comes through our senses is, at the end, just an idea. And so there is no physical world. There are only our ideas about the physical world. And the only evidence we have that the physical world exists is our ability to sense it. But what ends up as the final destination of that sensing is an idea that we form. And so existence for Barclay is actually only an idea, not a physical thing or a set of physical phenomena. And for that reason, Barclay's philosophy is often called idealism. And so he denies the existence of physical things. And he argues in a very shocking way that physical things could not possibly exist without a perceiving mind. So there is no existence of the physical things. There are only perceiving minds, and perception becomes, if you like, the facilitator of our knowledge of existence, but that knowledge itself is ideational, not physical. So in a certain sense, there is an agreement with Descartes at the end about ideas and about minds, but unlike Descartes, he denies that the physical world has a separate existence, because if there were nobody there to perceive anything, then nothing would exist. And didn't one of you raise that perennial question? Remind me. At the end of Monday's lecture last week, I believe that one of you asked that question about a forest, a tree falling in the forest. And if there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound?
Someone did ask that, yes.
Yeah, someone did. Thank you. Someone always does. I don't know how that still circulates, but everybody still knows that question. That's still in common circulation. Okay, so I'm going to give you Barclay's answer. So Barclay would say, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, then how do you know there's a tree and how do you know there's a forest? So the only way you could know that there was a tree falling in the forest was if you were in the forest observing it or hearing it. And certainly it would, if you were able to hear it, make a sound. But even if you didn't have the faculty of hearing, if you were in the forest and you were deaf, right? Let's say for the sake of argument, you're in the forest, but you didn't have the sense of hearing, and the tree fell, you would still be able to feel its vibration, or you would still be able to see it falling, right? There would be some sense data of some kind that would allow you to know that this tree is falling. And so if you couldn't hear it, you would still see it or feel it as it hit the ground. But if there was nobody there at all, if in some remote forest somewhere in Siberia, where there's no one at the moment, if a tree falls, Barclay is going to say to you, not only do we not hear the sound, but we cannot even be sure that there's such a tree in such a forest. Because if no one's observing it, how do you know it exists? It only exists as an idea in your mind. So existence is perception for Berkeley. And that's why he's an empiricist. Yes? This is what makes him an empiricist, because all of our knowledge about the world is gathered through our senses and not through our reason. That's number one. And that will lead him to this doctrine of monism. I want to share with you a very quick screen. I may have shared this last Monday or maybe not, but I'm going to share it again. At least this week it should be legible if we get a clear recording. So just bear with me. I have it ready here. All right. So you can see this, presumably. Now you see it, right? Basic ontologies. Does everybody see this?
Yeah.
Thank you. So basic ontologies, ontology means philosophy of being or existence, contrasted with epistemology, which means philosophy of knowledge, right? But they are linked together. And ontology comes in various forms. So just to run through this briefly, so we can situate Descartes and Barclay and compare them. There are people who are nihilists ontologically, and a nihilist will tell you that there are no kinds of things in the world, or perhaps, in fact, there's nothing at all. And there are different versions of nihilism. One example would be Nagarjuna from Indian philosophy, that all phenomena are empty of self-existence. We teach this in Buddhism. It's a very interesting doctrine. It means all phenomena are connected, but nothing is really standing alone and existing alone. So existence is like a continuum. That's not nihilism, but the nihilistic part is the denial that there's any entity that exists independently of all other entities. So it is a form of emptiness rather than nihilism. But there are other kinds of nihilists. Jason Turner is a contemporary, I believe, an American, and you can look him up and read about his ontological nihilism. Then there's monism, right? Monism is a belief that there's one kind of thing or one mode of being. And this week and next, we're going to look at two very different monists. Barclay is an idealist, as I've mentioned to you, and we're going to see in his own words. He believes there is only one kind of thing that exists, namely ideas in the mind. And if you have ideas of the physical world, that doesn't prove that the physical world exists. It only proves that you have ideas of the physical world. So the only thing that exists for Barclay are ideas. This is very shocking, but a very interesting doctrine. And yet that's not the only kind of monism, because we could do the flip side of that, and maybe some of you will be more comfortable with it, or you're more accustomed to hearing about it, and that's a mode of monism that we call materialism. The idea that the notion that there is only one kind of thing, and that is stuff, right? Matter, the atoms of the periodic table, combine to form the compounds and so forth. So the elements of existence, which themselves are formed of subatomic particles and so forth, all constitute material one way or another. And we ourselves, as biological beings, are formed of more complex aggregations of those elements and compounds and DNA and so forth, just a very long string of them. And so we have this notion that the universe is made of material things, and only material things, and that mind may well be just a word for the parts of the brain function that we don't understand. And that will be Churchland's point of view next week. So we're going to look at two very different and incompatible monists. One, namely Barclay, believing that everything is made of ideas, and then a more modern and perhaps a more custom view that of Churchland, a contemporary philosopher who believes that there is only material stuff in the world. Okay, those are two monisms. Dualism we've encountered, and that's also a very common doctrine. Many of you may be Cartesian and didn't know it until last week, but dualism is the idea that there are two kinds of things or two modes of beings, and that thesis exists in many variations as well. Descartes is what we call a substance dualist because he believes there are two kinds fundamentally of substances in the world, namely mental stuff, or res cogitans, thinking things, and that was Latin, that's his terminology, and res extensa, or extended things, things that take up space, which are what we today would call matter or material, physical substance. So Descartes is a dualist, and there are many kinds of dualisms, and I won't go into them now, but if you look deeply into ontology, you'll discover many, many manifestations of dualist doctrines. And then, of course, there's pluralism. You might also, at the end of the day, want to argue that there are many kinds of things or many modes of beings. And we looked at an example from the ancient world. I think it was Empedocles, among others, who asserted there were four. People had looked around. This was not just the Greeks, but the Chinese and the Indians and many other ancient civilizations just looked at the world and said, well, there seem to be four kinds of things, right? Fire, earth, air, water. That's a kind of, by today's standards, simplistic and sort of also wrong, but nonetheless, it's easy to understand how people could have tried to classify existence as this quartet of more fundamental elements. Are we clear? Let me look at the chat room. Everyone's good. Yeah, the Egyptians too. Sure. There were lots of ancient people who thought this way, certainly, because people have always wondered. You know, I think this is, once again, the issue that philosophy has been with us for longer than recorded history, and that the human being in our earlier and perhaps prehistoric manifestations was always an inquiring or an inquisitive being. Our big brains are always trying to figure out what goes on and how things work and what things are made of and so forth. I mean, we had fire and methods of making it, for example, long before we had theories of combustion. So people are always trying to learn about the universe and how it works. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the different kinds of ontologies that you might want to subscribe to, or, you know, one or more of them. But we're now going to turn to Barclay and to Berkeley's rather famous dialogues. This is after Descartes. Now we're looking in the 18th century. Berkeley is part of the Enlightenment, and he's one of a quartet of very famous British empiricists, not all of whom agreed with each other again, but they were lumped together as British empiricists. And I also want to say to you that if you're interested in following up these terms that we're developing, and or interested in looking more deeply at any of the philosophers that we're discussing or the theories that they defend, then there are outside resources that can help you to deepen or broaden your understanding. And I'll just type two of them in. If you're looking for just a good definition, I would say the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is very good. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I'm typing that into the chat room. That gives you some good definitions of terms and a little explanation of them. If you want something more robust, more substantive, and more scholarly, then I would turn to the Stanford Online Encyclopedia. The Stanford University's Encyclopedia of Philosophy is fantastic. It has articles which are probably in more depth than you might need, but each entry is written by an expert in the field, someone who really knows a lot about that particular philosopher or philosophy or epistemology or ontology, as the case may be. So any term or any person you look up in the Stanford Encyclopedia will return to you a wealth of really beautifully crafted information, probably beyond what you really need for this course, but it doesn't hurt to raise the bar for yourselves, to push yourselves a little further. And also you may want to look at some of the references and the citations that you'll find in there. So those are two handy resources for probing more deeply and beyond the primary readings in this course. All right. So let's, without further ado, unless there are any questions about what has been said thus far, let me share the dialogues with you. We're going to look at the first dialogue of Berkeley's 3 and see how he develops this idealism. Any questions before we proceed? And everybody's very quiet this morning. Okay, so you're in full retention mode. You're very engaged. I hope that's why you're quiet. You're paying full attention. All right, let's challenge you now with Barclay. And this guy is even more radical in a certain way than Descartes, as you're going to find out. The dialogue is set up in the following way. And some of you have looked at it. It's in your Google Drive folders in my group, and I assume that your other instructors have shared it with you, because this dialogue, or these dialogues of Barclay, are not in the required text. They're one or two readings that are not, so I provided them separately. So in the dialogue, there are two characters, and one of them is Barclay's voice, and it's the name of the character is Philonis, and that means in Greek love of mind. So we know that character will be speaking for Barclay. And the other character is called Hylas. And Hylas in Greek means matter. So Hylas is a materialist. Hylas is convinced that there's a real world made of stuff out there. And that is, of course, the opinion of which Barclay will try to disabuse him, and will. But Hylas could never quite believe it, even though he will be convinced by the end of Dialogue 1 that there's no such thing as material substance. He still, at the same time, he can't believe it. He can't let himself to believe it. He's too committed to the notion of extramental reality, even when it's been demonstrated to him quite robustly that there's nothing in the world but ideas. He finds it impossible. So he ends up being very conflicted. All right. So without further ado, then, let me pull up this dialogue. We'll see if the screen share is still working. Looks like. And there we go. So here are the three dialogues between Hylas, meaning matter or material substance, yes, and Philonis, meaning love of mind, in opposition to skeptics and atheists. And there's an ulterior motive. Barclay wrote this with an ulterior motive, and I will perhaps explain that a bit further afterward. But we're going to look at the philosophy first, and then we can talk a bit about the sociology. Sometimes, or maybe even often, philosophers have ulterior motives in writing things. So, as you can see, it should say somewhere that it was from the 18th century, but apparently not in the text itself. But it is the 1700s, and this is, of course, a new PDF that was launched in 2004. But this thing comes from the 18th century. And we're going to look at the first dialogue, and feel free to read ahead if you like. So these two characters are I guess they're both in a college, and they're wandering around in the quad. They meet each other, and they're just chatting to begin with. And then Hylas says to him I've highlighted this in yellow, right? And Hylas says to him, in last night's conversation, you were represented as someone who maintains the most extravagant opinion that ever entered into the mind of man, namely that there is no such thing as material substance in the world. So you understand that by material substance, he's talking about physically existing things, right? Physically existing things. Material meaning made of matter. And substance, well, we use the word substance to mean the same thing. Substance is actually a Latin word. I mean, its origins are Latin. And the etymology of substance is substare. In Latin, sub means underneath, as in submarine, subterranean, sub whatever, right? Substandard. Anything that means beneath or below has that prefix sub in Latin. And stare in Latin means to stand. So a substance actually is something that stands under what it is that we're perceiving, all right? So, for example, a materialist will say, when you perceive water, the substance that stands under water is really two elements, H2O, as we know, so hydrogen and oxygen, right, are the more fundamental elements which comprise the substance that we call water. But that notion of substance means standing under something. And that also implies standing under it in an independently existing way, as a foundation stands under a building, right? So just to be clear about the meanings of these words. And Hylas says to him, so you were denying that there's material substance? And Philonous says, yep, I seriously believe there is no such thing as what philosophers call material substance. But if I were made to see anything absurd or skeptical in this, I would have the same reason to renounce this belief as I think I have now to reject the contrary opinion. So he's saying that he doesn't particularly find it extravagant. He just happens to believe something that he thinks he can defend, however uncommon it may be. And then they get into a bit of a debate about the meaning of skepticism, because Hylas says, can anything be more fantastic or in conflict with common sense or a more obvious piece of skepticism than to believe there is no such thing as matter? I mean, Hylas is dumbfounded by this, but Philonous explains, hang on, Hylas, what if it were to turn out that you, who hold that matter is there, hold meaning believe, this is older English, if you hold something in this time, it meant you believed it, like holding an opinion, okay? Believing something to be the case. If you hold that there is matter, what if it turns out that that's even a worse kind of skepticism? And Helios says, you have no chance of convincing me of this. But nonetheless, he does back off a little bit. And Philonous says over here, how does it happen, Hylas, that you call me a skeptic because I deny what you affirm, namely the existence of matter? For all you know, I may be as firmly convinced in my denial as you are in your affirmation. So in neither case is that skepticism, right? Skepticism is some kind of disbelief in something, but just because two people have different beliefs about a given matter doesn't mean that they're both skeptics. Denying what somebody else affirms or affirming what somebody else denies doesn't necessarily make you a skeptic. And Hylas admits that. Okay, he admits that his definition of skeptic is wrong. Philonous is not a skeptic, but he is definitely advancing something which is, to most people's way of thinking, impossible. So, let us see, he says. And Hylas says, Hylas comes back to him, what do you think about distrusting the senses or denying the real existence of sensible things or claiming to know nothing of them? Isn't that enough to qualify a man as a skeptic? And here, a piece of terminology which will recur, sensible things, right? You see that phrase, sensible things, and Barclay, in the mouth of Philonous, indeed denies the real independent existence of sensible things, but that meaning of sensible has changed in time. And I think the older meaning of it, and the meaning intended here, is much more straightforward, actually, because a sensible thing means, in this context, a thing which can be sensed, right? We would talk about a thing which could be seen or heard or touched or tasted or smelled, and anything that could be sensed would therefore be a sensible thing. And that's the meaning of the word sensible now in this dialogue, just to point it out to you. What does it mean today if we say that something is sensible? What do we usually mean? Anyone?
Maybe that it makes sense.
Yes, that it makes sense. Yeah, meaning somehow it's rational or logical, right? And so that word has really changed. But if you think about it for a moment, you may agree that this is actually a more accurate meaning. A sensible thing, meaning a thing that can be sensed, right? That's more of a faithful meaning to the root word. So that's in any case what the meaning is in this dialogue. So a sensible thing is not a thing that we would call rational necessarily, but it's a thing literally that can be sensed. And of course, what Barclay is going to argue now, to Hylas's dismay, is that the only way that things exist, or the only way that we can know if something exists, is that it is sensible. In other words, can be sensed. So he says, let us see which of us it is that denies the reality of sensible things or claims to have the greatest ignorance of them. And that's where they proceed. And so here you get this definition on the next page. What do you mean by sensible things? Philonous wants to get clear about the terminology before they start debating this. And Hylas says, well, sensible things are things that are perceived by the senses. Can you imagine that I mean anything else? I mean, that's what I was saying to you. It's what they both agree on. Anything that can be perceived by the senses is obviously a sensible thing in this context. Now there's an important distinction. So please pay attention to this next paragraph. Every step of the way is like a building block if you want to understand and appreciate the edifice of Barclay's argument. Then you just need to make sure you understand each building block that he adds to it. So he now asks this question by way of distinguishing between what he calls immediate perceptions and mediate perception. So these are two different terms and they mean very different things. So he asks him, are things perceived by the senses only the ones that are perceived immediately, or do they include things that are perceived mediately, that is through the intervention of something else? And this is a very big question, and Hylas doesn't understand it at the beginning. So Barclay explains it to him. In reading a book, what I immediately perceive are the letters on the page. But in other words, what the eye perceives, if you're reading what the eye perceives, is called immediate perception. If you're listening to something, what the ear perceives is an immediate perception. But it is something else that intervenes later in order to give you some kind of knowledge about what you have just seen or heard. So, for example, when you're reading a book, the eye does not know the meanings of the words. You may be seeing squiggles on a page, but it is not your eye that tells you that a certain squiggle is the word God or the word virtue or the word truth. These are suggested for Philonous and therefore for Barclay to the mind. So the letters are sensible things. The letters on the page are the things the eye sees, but they are only perceived immediately. And it is the mind that makes sense of them. And of course, Descartes would agree with that, right? The mind is making sense of them to tell us what those letters stand for. And if you were reading a book in a language you didn't understand, your eye would still see the letters on the page, right? But you wouldn't know what the meaning is. Is that correct? Is that clear? Yeah?
Yes.
Good. I mean, this is a very important point. It's not a difficult point, but it's a point we have to realize that our eye is not reading the book. The eye is sending the information about what's on the page to the brain. If you know the language, then Barclay would say then it's your mind that's making sense of the letters, and those are what he calls mediate perceptions. Similarly, if you hear a sound, your ear does not know whether that sound is a trumpet or a guitar or a drum or a garbage can being rattled. I mean, your ear just picks up acoustic vibration, not just, but it does. It picks up the acoustic vibration. It sends that information somehow to the auditory cortex, and it's in your mind that you're going to decide, oh, yes, that's a guitar or that's a violin or a piano or a garbage can being rattled, right? It's your mind that's going to discern what that particular immediate perception is and make a judgment as to what it is. And maybe you're going to say, oh, the music's too loud, turn it down, right? Or the music's too soft, turn it up. But your ear is not doing that work. Your ear is just sending the information. Clear? Are we clear? So by sensible things, we mean those that can be perceived immediately by sense. And they agree about that. So Philonous is leading this somewhere. And so when I hear a variety of sounds, I cannot be said to hear their causes. Right? When you hear a noise, you're hearing the acoustic vibration. The energy that is being propagated is what falls on the eardrum, makes it vibrate, and then the data gets sent in somewhere. But it's not the ear that decides what the cause of the sound is. That's got to be done by mediate perception in the mind. For Barclay, it would be the mind. Okay? So they're now clear about that terminology, and it's quite important. So sensible things include only those things that are immediately perceived by sense. And so by sight, we perceive immediately light, colors, and shapes. By hearing, we perceive sounds. By the palate, We perceive taste by the sense of smell, odors, and by touch, anything that's tangible or palpable or touchable. And those are the sensible things that are perceived immediately by the senses. And Hylas agrees, and I think that's a perfectly clear explanation. But then a real shocking thing, if you think about it, this is part one of the shock. So Philonous says very innocently, so it seems that if you take away all sensible qualities, there is nothing left that is sensible. Well, it follows. I mean, if I tell you that something exists, but it cannot be seen, heard, tasted, smelled, or touched, then what is there? What's left of it? The answer is nothing, right? Because in order for you to know that something exists, it would have to be perceptible to your immediate perceptions. It would have to be either seen or heard or tasted or smelled or touched and or any combination of those things. So let me ask you, for example, I don't know where you all are today. I mean, you're probably in your rooms in front of your computers. I don't know what you see if you look out the window, but let me ask you a question just to make this clear. And I'll play the devil's advocate for Barclay here to really push home this point. Suppose I asked you, is the Empire State Building still there? Does the Empire State Building exist?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, then Barclay would say, how do you know?
I saw it before.
Oh, you saw it. Okay. When did you last see it?
Like a month ago.
Okay, so Barclay would say, so you saw it a month ago, so for you, for sure it existed a month ago, but how do you know it exists now?
What if you watch it through like a live clock, or not clock, live camera?
Sure, so you're watching it. So you're seeing it. So its existence, therefore, depends on your seeing it, right? Are you with me?
Yes.
So there's no other way you could know. So Barclay is saying to Hylas, and I'm saying to you, there's no other way you could know that the Empire State Building is still there unless you were able to sense it in some way. You could look out your window and see it, or watch it on live television, right? With someone with a camera, or watch someone streaming a video standing there. So you're using your sense of sight. Or if you yourself were on the corner of 34th and 5th and you were leaning on the building, that would be your sense of touch. Or if someone told you, I just was there, I just came back from there, so you heard about it. But you realize now that the existence of this thing depends upon it being sensed.
So it only exists if I think it exists?
It only exists in the first case if you can sense it.
Is that why we say see it to believe it?
That's a saying, seeing is believing, probably could be derived from this. But the only evidence we have that it exists, says Barclay, is that we can sense it.
But
So
I mean,
when-
she knew it existed a month ago. It's not like a building is gonna stop existing.
How do you know?
So when we say exists, does that mean like exists in my reality? So
Well, there you go. Exists how? Exists as you have an idea of it because you perceived it. So it exists as an idea.
okay.
Okay, we're getting a little clearer now. We have to clear away a lot of veils of habitual thinking, which are certainly not Barclayan idealism. But as we start to peel away these layers of habitual thinking, I know that some of you are going to be truly shocked by the consequences, by the conclusion. And this is where Philonous is leading Hylas. And believe me, Hylas is going to be kicking and screaming and resisting every step of the way because he doesn't like where this is going. But yet he's not going to be able, by rational argument, to prevent the argument from going through. So, I mean, it's just like this. If I told you, let's say you can all see me, or say I have something in my hand. Let's pretend I have something in my hand, okay? So I'm holding something in my hand. And if I said to you, the thing I'm holding in my hand cannot be seen, cannot be heard, cannot be tasted, cannot be smelled, and cannot be touched. So what could I possibly be holding in my hand?
Nothing.
Nothing. And that's the end of the story. Therefore, the existence of the thing that I'm supposedly holding in my hand depends completely on our ability to sense it. And if I open my hand and show you, look, here it is, and you're going to say to me, there's nothing there. And why would you say that? Because you can't sense it, because it hasn't got any sensible qualities. And you'd be right. If you can't see it, hear it, taste it, smell it, or touch it, you'd be right to say there's nothing there. But flip that around and say, well, the only way we know that anything is there is if we can sense it. And that's the empiricist doctrine, right? That's the empiricist epistemology, that our knowledge of the outside world depends completely on our senses. Are we clearer now? I hope some of you are shocked by this. It's very uncomplicated in a certain way, but it's a very shocking argument. Now, that's the purpose of philosophy, right? I want to subvert your beliefs. I want to make you think in a different way, see things in a different way. Okay, let's carry on. And Hylas, of course, is not going to like this, but now Barclay's going to give him some examples of how this works. And again, some of you are going to probably be like Hylas and to resist, which is fine. And some of you will see where Barclay's going with this, and you'll be quite shocked by it. So he does agree, though, that is, Hylas agrees with Philonous that if you take away all the sensible qualities, then nothing is left that is sensible. And if nothing is left that is sensible, then nothing exists as far as we know. So existence does depend on perception. It doesn't depend on anything else. It can't. And Hylas agrees with that. So Philonous goes a little further. Sensible things then are nothing but so many sensible qualities or combinations of sensible qualities. So what appears to exist to us is doing so by virtue of being a bundle of sensible qualities, things and properties that we can sense. That's what we say makes something exist. And Hylas agrees with that. But now what's going to happen is Philonous will get down to certain cases and try to explain this in a little more depth. And one of the things that he's going to tell him is, for example, that the fire is not hot. And the fire only feels hot because we can sense it that way, but the fire itself is not hot. And that may be a little bit shocking to you, but we'll go there momentarily. Here's the point. Does the reality of sensible things, Philonous asks, does the reality of sensible things consist in being perceived, or is it something different? Right? That's the fundamental ontological question. Do things exist only because they're being perceived, or is there something else that contributes to their existence? And Hylas, being a convinced materialist, says that to exist is one thing and to be perceived is another. And many of you probably are accustomed to thinking, just as Hylas does, that existence is one thing and perception of something is quite another thing. But remember, he's just admitted on the previous page that if you take away all the sensible qualities from something, namely take away all the things we perceive, then there's nothing left. So again, Philonous is saying that existence and perception are one and the same thing, and that moreover, we can never know about existence without perception. And that's why his bumper sticker is, to exist is to be perceived. But Hylas thinks that existence is one thing and perception is another thing. And that's why Philonous is going to try to convince him that he's mistaken. And Philonous says, I'm talking about only sensible things. My question is, by real existence of one of them, do you mean an existence exterior to the mind and distinct from their being perceived? So things are out there somehow without being perceived? And Hylas says, I mean a real absolute existence, distinct from and having no relation to their being perceived. So that's the materialist view, that there's stuff out there, whether there's anybody around to perceive it or not, right? And this is now giving us at least a clear picture of where they diverge, because Hoyless does believe strongly at this point to exist as one thing and to be perceived as another. And Philonous all along is believing that there's no existence without perception. So the two are definitely linked. And so there's an argument now about pain and about fire, about certain sensations. And he's asking him whether, in fact, that the experience of these things is in the things, or is it in our minds, having come through the senses? And let me give you an example of how this will work. And this example is with respect to water and whether water is warm or cold. And Hylas, being a materialist, would say that the warmth or the coldness of water exists somehow as a property of the water. Like if we talk about the water being hot, we think like that's something that is in the water, or the water being cold, that's something, again, that's in the water. And Philonous is going to argue that no, this is only a question of our perception. And how he does it is through a very ingenious thought experiment. And this one you can try at home. He says to Hylas, take 2 bowls of water and put them at room temperature. So take 2 bowls of water and put them on the counter, and let them stand at room temperature. So the 2 bowls of water are at the same temperature. Now he says, take one hand of your hands and let's say put it in the ice box. So they didn't have refrigerators, they had ice, or put your hand in the freezer for a few seconds, let it cool down. Your other hand, run it under hot water for a minute, let it warm up. And then plunge your hands. One of your hands is cooled off, the other hand is warmed up. Plunge your hands into these 2 bowls of water, which you know to be the same temperature, right? You know they're the same temperature. So the hand that's been cooled off, when you put it into water at room temperature, how's that water going to feel?
Cold.
I'm sorry, the hand that's been cooled off,
Hotter.
it's going to feel warm when you put it in there. And the hand that's been heated up under hot water, when you put it into tepid water at room temperature, how's that going to feel? Cold, right. So your 2 hands are going to have 2 different sensations of how that water feels. One hand will feel hot, the other hand will feel cold, but you know perfectly well that both of those bowls of water are the same temperature. So Philonous' conclusion is that the feeling of heat or coldness is in your perceptions, not in the water at all, because the same water cannot be both hot and cold at the same time. You follow this? So it must be your perceptions of heat and cold, which your sensations of heat and cold, which are in your perceptions and not in the water at all.
Professor?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Please.
So I have a question about like the perception, or maybe a better word would be about the knowledge of existence of oxygen. So we cannot see oxygen, but we definitely know it's there because we are all alive now and things are happening inside our bodies that are dependent on oxygen. Without them, we would be dead. So just because we cannot see oxygen in the air, does that mean that we cannot see it and we cannot perceive it, so it's not existence?
No, Barclay would say the fact that that's a great question, by the way, great question. So oxygen is not visible normally to us in its gaseous form. If you liquefy it, it is. Use it for rocket fuel, you could see it. And you can also watch it combust. But in its gaseous form, correct, we don't see O2 floating around. Certainly we don't, but we feel it. And Barclay would say, because if you take a broom and pump the oxygen out of it, we're going to lose consciousness. So the very fact that we're conscious means that we are breathing oxygen. So we have indirect evidence that the oxygen exists, because if we took it away, we would lose consciousness. So we can, in a certain sense, feel it. And if in fact what happens in an airplane, if it's not pressurized, you know that people get hypoxia as you start ascending and the air gets thinner. You can feel all kinds of things. If you're walking up a mountain, some people will feel the effects at 5,000 feet, others 10, but as you ascend, there's a certain height, a certain altitude at which your own body will experience a shortage of oxygen. And what will you start to feel as the air gets thinner? Anybody?
Dizzy or something?
Yes, you'll feel dizzy. You may get a headache. You may be short of breath just walking around. So you can, in fact, sense indirectly that there's a presence or an absence of oxygen by means of your own physical responses, which you are monitoring through the senses. So the existence of oxygen still comes to us in some way or another through the senses.
So
Okay,
does
that-
Berkeley count an indirect evidence or indirect perception also as part of being an idea? Not
Well,
not
that's a really
clear.
good question. It will contribute to our ideas. Right now, he's arguing in a more straightforward way. Indirect perceptions will also contribute to our ideas. But I mean, being dizzy is not an indirect perception. If you're experiencing a shortage of oxygen, being dizzy and having a headache and being short of breath, these are not indirect, right? These are direct sensations from your own body, are they not?
They are.
They are. So those sensations are going to tell you something. And what you're probably going to conclude if you have some modern knowledge of science is that you need more oxygen. So that's basically, and what do they do in an ER? Or what do they do if they suspect you of suffering from COVID these days? They're going to look at your oxygenation, right? There's going to be a meter that they plug on your finger, which is going to tell them what level of oxygenation you have. Should be above 94 or 95%. If it's less than that, then again, we have a immediate perception through an instrument that there isn't enough oxygen in our bodies. So in any case, this has to do with, we're still in the dialogue dealing with direct perception. But I think even your question could be answered that way through feelings in the body when deprived of oxygen. So that's still direct perception that our bodies give us of dizziness, of shortness of breath, of a headache, and so forth. But back to the example, I want to really shake you up a little bit and make you realize that when we plunge our finger into hot water or accidentally, drink something that's too hot and we get a burning sensation in our mouths, the tea is too hot or the coffee is too hot or the soup is too hot, and we feel that unpleasant sensation and we say it's too hot. What is heat actually? What does it mean physically if you want to stay in this scientific mode? If we talk about one bowl of water being hotter than the other, what do we really mean by that? We know we have a good explanation for it now. And what does it mean to say that something is hot? Anybody? Can't hear you. Please speak up.
Oh, it's when your body, like your neurons are sensing movement of molecules.
It's the movement of molecules, exactly.
Right.
Heat is molecular motion, in other words. So there's no such thing as heat. When the molecules are moving quicker, we experience it as heat, right? It's not heat. It's movement. It's motion. Of course, it's generating something that we could call heat, but we only interpret it as heat. What feels hot to us, what happens when you put on an asbestos glove? Well, I guess they don't sell those anymore. But when you put on an oven mitt, in the old days, they were asbestos. If you buy oven mitts, it allows you to remove something hot from the oven without feeling heat, right?
Yeah.
You with me?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you know the thing is hot? The only way you would know the thing is hot is if you accidentally touched it and it burned you, correct?
Yeah.
So what's heat? It's a sensation. And that's what Barclay's saying. The only way we know if something's hot is we feel it. So it doesn't exist in the object, it exists in us. And you know that some people can tolerate extremes of temperature better than others? Have you ever seen these polar bear clubs? These people go swimming in ice water without clothes, right? They cut a hole in the ice, they jump in, they swim around, they come out. They don't stay too long, but they're the polar bear club, they're called, right? Now, some people couldn't dip their toe into freezing water. They'd just be too, I don't like freezing water. So what does it mean if some people don't mind it and other people, do mind it? The water's the same temperature. It's our feeling. It's our sensation that is telling us that it's too hot or too cold or just right. But that too hot or too cold or just rightness is not in the water. It's in our sensations. So the existence of the heat or the cold or the just rightness is in our sensations, not in the water. That's the argument that Barclay's trying to make. Let me illustrate this with a different sense. And Hylas goes along with this. Well, I'm content to give up this point, admit that heat and cold are only sensations existing in our minds. Still, he says there are plenty of other things which really exist, externally in the objects themselves. So this is the devastating point here where Philonous says, but what would you say, Hylas, if it turns out that the same argument applies with regard to all the other sensible qualities, that none of them can be supposed to exist outside the mind? And Hylas is so entrenched in materialism, he says that would be quite a feat to prove it. Well, he's already proved it with the sense of touch, that there's no such thing as heat or cold in the objects. It's only in our sensations that we call things hot or cold. And of course, Philonous is going to be able to do this with every other sense. And here's the next one. Hylas says, can anyone in his right mind, I didn't highlight it, but there it is. Can anyone in his right mind doubt, says Hylas, that sugar is sweet or that wormwood is bitter? Wormwood is some kind of extract, very bitter thing. So here we go. We're going to make the same argument with taste, and that the sweetness or the bitterness of things is not in the things, but it's in our taste buds. You see where this is going? Why is it that some people find certain desserts too sweet and others don't find them sweet enough? Have you had that experience?
Yeah.
Yes, of course you have. You'll find if you go out with your friends or you sit around with your family and eat things, some people have a real sweet tooth and they love sweet things. Other people find things too sweet. They can't eat it because it's too sweet. Or for that matter, too hot. What about hot food? Some cultures have really spicy food, like Mexican food, Thai food, Indian food. They use some very, what we would call spicy condiments and hot peppers, beyond jalapeno, right? We could talk about some of the even hotter ones, like habanero, really super hot stuff. Now, why is it some people can eat that stuff and not be bothered by it, and others would feel that their mouths are burning up? Because the thing is the same, that they're eating, but some people find it very tasty and other people feel like they're on fire. So the sensation of taste cannot be in the object. It has to be in the perception again. Whether we're talking about sweet food or hot food, it's in the perceptions, is it not? Because we all have a different experience of it.
Correct.
Okay, so the sense of taste works the same way as the sense of touch. It's things that which we would call spicy or sweet or salty or bitter. The taste is not in the food, it's in our taste buds, it's in our sensations. That's why some people want to put more salt in something. Other people would say it's too salty already. And when confronted with this, Hylas says, well, now I'm having trouble believing that these things exist independently of sense. So everything depends on perception. And he goes through the rest of it, along with sounds. And the same argument will go through. The same thing with the other senses. Colors. This I'm asking you to read ahead. But here's the same argument with colors. We look at a beautiful sunset, right? Imagine we look at a beautiful sunset. And what colors do you see in the clouds in the sky? What colors typically would you see?
Orange.
Yes. Oh, there's a beautiful, oh, Justin, good job. There's a nice sunset. Okay. So we see pink, we see violet, we see red, we see different orange, sometimes yellows. We see beautiful colors in the sunset. Okay, let me ask you this. Suppose you're watching the sunset and everybody sees these beautiful colors. Suppose you're flying a plane through the sunset. Suppose you're in an old plane, a biplane, so you could actually stick your hand out and suppose you're just flying through those clouds in a plane. Do you see all those colors?
You see perhaps the one that you're closer to?
Yeah, well, what color is a cloud really if you're flying through it?
white.
Is it white?
It's
Is
pretty
it-
transparent.
Clear.
It's a good question, right?
It's transparent when you're blind.
Yes, it's really mostly water vapor. And when they look very dark, it's because they have a lot of water vapor, right? A lot of moisture in the cloud. If it's a very fluffy cloud, less. But if you stuck a jar out, say you flew through a cloud during a beautiful sunset, and you stuck a jar out, and captured some of that cloud and took it back to the lab, would the cloud have reds and oranges and yellows in it? No. So the beautiful sunset was never in the cloud. The color of the beautiful sunset was not in the cloud. It was in your perception. And whatever the color the cloud appears to you is in your perception. It's not in the cloud. If you want a worse example, I'll even go beyond Barclay. And if they ask you what you learned in school today, you'll probably, shock them. But, okay, so what color is the grass normally?
Green.
Green, right? Okay, but actually the grass is not green at all. Why do we see the grass as green? Why does the grass appear green to our eyes? Do you know why? Well, because it reflects that wavelength of light around 6,000 angstroms. It doesn't absorb that wavelength because grass photosynthesizes like all other plants, and it doesn't find much use for that wavelength of light. So it absorbs all the wavelengths that it can use during the photosynthetic process, but green is not energetically useful. So it actually absorbs every other color of the spectrum and reflects the green back because it's not using it. And so in fact, to be more accurate, the grass is every color except green. So, I mean, think about it. That's what grass is doing. It's reflecting green back to us, but there's no green in the grass. There's every other color in the grass because it's using those colors. Okay? Or rather wavelengths of light, which we see as color. So this is the whole idea, once again, that perception is in the eye. What we see is in terms of our perception and not in terms of the thing that we're supposedly seeing. So for the longest time, people had no idea that cosmic rays were streaming through the atmosphere because you can't see them, right? So they have no existence. They had no existence for us. You can't see ultraviolet because it's not in the visible spectrum. So unfortunately, we only know when we've been exposed to too much UV when we get sunburn. If we get sunburn, we know. Then we could see that we had overexposure, but you don't see the UV. But you do see it ultimately when it burns you, when it burns the skin. But this, once again, depends on perception. So now he's leading Hylas to this conclusion, and that's what we're going to close with today, and then we'll take some questions. But through these arguments, Hylas now, in this highlighted portion, is where Hylas admits, he says, I have to admit, Philonous, against all these arguments, I can't keep this up any longer. Colors, sounds, tastes, in a word, all that are termed secondary qualities have no existence outside the mind, meaning no existence outside the immediate perceptions of the senses that were gated to the mind from which we formed the judgment or the immediate perception of what it was we were perceiving. But that is all existence is. It's ideas in the mind which are stimulated by immediate perceptions. And Philonous grants and concedes that these things that we call colors, tastes, and also would be colors, sounds, tastes, and smells, all the things pertaining to the five senses are all what they used to call secondary qualities. And he now admits that they have no existence outside the mind. But then he draws a line, because Hylas is still not convinced that all existence depends on perception. He is halfway there now. They used to distinguish in the old days between secondary and primary qualities. Qualities are like properties of things. And Hylas has conceded that the secondary qualities exist only in our minds, and not outside the mind. I mean, color blindness would be another example, right? People who are colorblind cannot see red and green, right? Or maybe some of you are, and you would have difficulty distinguishing red and green. Generally, people who suffer from this would see grays. They would see shades of gray. So for them, red and green don't exist because they can't perceive them. And similarly, all these other so-called secondary qualities that come through the five senses have no existence outside the mind. So Philonous has persuaded Hylas of half of this thesis. But the other half is where Hylas digs in his heels, and he says, but we also have at the same time a bunch of primary qualities. And Hylas is going to insist that the primary qualities really do exist in the bodies or in the objects and are not dependent on our perception. And these so-called primary qualities, and he lists them, and some of them are in a vocabulary we still use. So here are the primary qualities. Extendedness, that would mean length or area or volume, right? The idea of extension means the idea of taking up space. So Hylas would say that's the length of something, or the area of something, or the volume of something. That's what's called primary, and that really exists in the thing, says Hylas, not in our perceptions. And another one of the primary qualities is shape. Well, we mean, is it a sphere? Is it a triangle? Is it a square? Right? That's what we mean by shape. And he says that really exists in the object, not in our perceptions. Solidity. Presumably would mean density, right? Mass over unit volume, the density of something that exists in the object. Gravity, meaning weight, presumably weight. Motion is something moving or not. The velocity of an object is in the object, says Hylas, not in our perceptions. Something is moving independently of our perceptions if it's moving. And rest, meaning not moving at all. So these are the primary qualities. And though Hylas has conceded, again, I'll repeat, Hylas has conceded that the secondary qualities exist only in our perceptions, and that's half of Philonous' thesis. But Hylas is digging in his heels. He's drawing a line. He's saying, but the primary qualities are really in the outside world. They're really in, external reality. And these things really exist in bodies independent of our perception. Okay? Secondary qualities are all the sensible qualities that aren't primary, and philosophers assert that these are merely sensations or ideas existing nowhere but in the mind, and so he concedes that, but he says the primary qualities are really out there regardless of whether anybody's perceiving them or not, and maybe you agree with that. So the second part of this dialogue, of course, will be Philonous' mission to convince Hylas that even the primary qualities exist only in the mind, only through our perceptions, and do not really inhere in these so-called external objects. And once again, if all the secondary qualities and all the primary qualities are only in our minds, are only in our ideas, then clearly existence is only in our ideas. There can't be anything else left out there. So the second half of the dialogue, which I encourage you to read ahead of your breakaway lectures, is where Philonous will embark on this other part of his argument to convince Hylas that the primary qualities also depend on perception and nothing else. And that's where we will go in our breakout lecture on Thursday. So I'm going to stop the share now. And we've covered what I wanted to cover with you today. Let's have a look at the questions. We have some time remaining. And so I'm just looking at the last questions to pop up. Are you saying that not everyone sees a certain wavelength the same? Of course not everyone does. We don't hear, for example, I'll change it to we didn't see images of galaxies, of certain features of galaxies, until we developed telescopes that looked in the infrared or that looked in the X-ray, right? We have all kinds of different wavelengths available to us now, which we did not have in the earlier days of astronomy, where they were only looking in the optical. So as soon as we developed telescopes using infrared, we saw the universe differently, did we not? We saw things that we couldn't see with our optical vision with our in the optical so-called optical spectrum, and therefore we became aware of the existence of things that we hadn't seen before. And how do we become aware of them? Because we could see them for the first time. So their existence depended completely on our perception. We didn't know they existed. Why not? Because we couldn't see them. Then we started looking at different wavelengths. If you put on night goggles, you know, why is it that predators like lions or prefer to hunt at night? Well, they have a big advantage because they have night vision built in, right? They have an extra retina in the back. It reflects extra light back there, captures more light. So their night vision is like 5 to 10 times better than ours. So they can basically see at night because they gather more light than we do. So you'd be stumbling around in the dark because you're human, whereas a lion might see you and eat you because it sees you much more clearly. So you might not see the lion, but the lion would see you. So, you know, as far as the lion's concerned, you exist because it could see you. As far as you're concerned, the lion doesn't exist because you can't see it. It's all about perception. And so everything are secondary qualities according to Barclay? No. Rachel, there are two kinds of there are two sets of qualities. There are secondary and primary. I just explained go back and you'll see the list of primary qualities. Hylas is now convinced that the secondary qualities exist only in perception and not in the objects themselves. In the second half of this dialogue, I'll repeat, Hylas is going to be convinced against his will that also the primary qualities exist only in our perceptions and not in the objects themselves. And those primary qualities have to do with things like extension, mass, and density, velocity, and so forth. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? So I hope this has made you think a little bit about the nature of existence and its relation to perception. And that the only way, says Barclay, that we could actually know that anything exists is by perceiving it. And if there's something that nobody perceives whatsoever in any way, shape, or form, then how could we possibly say it exists? No, his answer is we can't, because existence is perception. The two are not different. To exist is to be perceived. And in the contrary sense, not to be perceived is not to exist. Okay? I see that you're digesting this. It's not the ordinary way of thinking about things. I know that. But it's a very interesting ontology. There are not many idealists in the world, but if you really pursue Barclay to the end of the argument, you may end up against your own habitual thinking and perhaps against your own desire to think differently, be convinced that ultimately what we call the external world is to us knowable only as a bunch of ideas in our minds. Because everything that we perceive in the outside world is not really there other than as a reflection in our minds in terms of ideas about what we have sensed. And I think an easier way to get a handle on this, for some of you who may be scratching your heads, is to think about animals that hear what we don't hear, like a dog whistle, right? Dogs have higher frequency hearing. So if you blow a dog whistle, which I think is like 35K, it's a huge high frequency beyond our ability to hear, you're not going to hear anything. You're going to say this whistle is defective. But if you blow it with a dog in the room, the dog will freak out because for the dog, it's a very loud whistle. So does the whistle make a sound? Well, for humans, it doesn't, because we don't hear it. But for dogs, it does, because they do. So is the sound in the whistle, or is the sound in your perception? You're bound to answer like Barclay, right? The sound is in your perception. If you don't hear it, it doesn't make a sound. If you do hear it, it does. So it can't be that the whistle is both making a sound and not making a sound at the same time. It's all about your perception. And if all our perceptions are working the same way, then existence definitely depends on perception and nothing else. And that's Barclay's point. All right, any last question? So Alexandra, so will we be the only thing in existence? Well, what does that mean? Since we are what we perceive, and for all we know, we are the only thing. Well, there is no thing. I think, Alexandra, you're on the right track. I think you're exactly on the right track. But you have to go one step further and realize that there are no things. There are only ideas. If you look in the mirror and perceive yourself, you're not a thing. You're a reflection in your mind. You exist as an idea. And now Vanessa says your mind is blown. I think that's mission accomplished. If I've blown anybody's mind this morning, or rather Barclay has blown your mind, then I would say mission accomplished. Okay, great stuff. No side effects from this. It's not like in the old days when our minds were blown back in the day. Sometimes it was problematic. But this is a great thing. If your mind is blown by a little philosophy, then it's making you think outside the box, right? That's the name of the game. Okay, great. I'm very glad. I'm very glad. Your mind is blown in a good way, giving you an alternative way to think about reality. That's always a good thing. Expand your consciousness, okay? That's the name of the game. So listen, thank you very much. Our time is up this morning, and some of you will be, yes, you need to digest this, exactly. It's expected. Barclay is shocking. Everybody who hears this for the first time is shocked by Barclay, and you should be. But I hope you continue in your breakout groups to disabuse yourselves, those of you who are thinking like Hylas and are dyed-in-the-wool materialists. You'll be disabused of the primary qualities too. You'll be convinced they only exist in your minds. And then we'll come to the end of Barclay this week. And then next week, we're going to look at Churchland. And Churchland is a monist of exactly the flip side. Churchland believes only material stuff exists. So he's going to tell you the opposite of Barclay. He's going to tell you that even thoughts are somehow made of what the brain is doing. So the mind itself is not really existing. It's only the activity of the brain that we call the mind, okay? Just to give you a preview, a little trailer of next week. We'll get the exact opposite view from a monist who believes only material things exist and ideas have no existence. They're just somehow phenomena which are generated from the material brain. Some of you may be happier with that explanation. Okay, anyway, I'm glad it's clear. I'm very glad it's clear, Maisha, and all of you are more than welcome. And I'll be lecturing on Monday. Yes, there's no class. Well, I told you before, let me repeat because it's important, that I am ignoring legal holidays and school holidays for the sake of delivering this course in our structured way. There is always going to be a Monday plenary. If I log on Monday morning next week and no one's in the room because it's some kind of holiday, that's fine. I'll upload it and you'll just have to watch it asynchronously. It's not a punishment. It's just, that's the way we structure things. If you look at the schedule that I've made available to everybody, the only week where we will not have a lecture will be the spring break week, because that whole week there are no classes. So that's fine. We all get a week off in April. But I will be here every Monday morning, rain or shine. And I'll be delivering the plenary lecture from 9:30 to 10:45 if you want to join me live. If the school says it's a legal holiday and the college is closed and there are no classes, you're not obliged to be here on Monday morning, but you will be obliged to watch the lecture asynchronously a short time later because it will be uploaded. Are we clear about that?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Because that's just the only way to fit everything in and stick with our synchronized schedule this term. Okay? So listen, have a great week, everyone. Enjoy your breakout lectures. And I'll be hopefully uploading this in a bit. And hopefully also the screen share will be clear from now going forward. Okay, see you all next Monday. Those of you who are in Section M, I'll see you all on Thursday. Have a great